Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security, Strategy and Policy Research, which is an autonomous center housed in the University of Lahore. CESPR tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic developments, and this program is part of that effort. Now, since the 7th October attack by Hamas and the Palestinian Jihad fighters against Israel, which is a settler-colonial apartheid state, we have done several episodes on the unfolding situation, including Israel's deliberately savage attack on Gaza and its civilian Palestinian population. The guests have included Israeli and non-Israeli Jewish experts and scholars, among others. As of the recording of this program, Israel has announced military plans for a ground assault on Rafah, the southernmost town in Gaza that borders Egypt. It has already bombarded targets in the town that now houses over 1 million internally displaced Gaza refugees. Effort is also afoot to get a deal for a ceasefire in exchange for the captured Israeli soldiers and some civilians. So far, Hamas's blueprint for a deal has been rejected by the largely right-wing war cabinet of Benjamin Netanyahu. Even biased mainstream Western publications, after penning the standard lines in favor of Israel and branding Hamas as a terrorist organization, have begun to caution Israel, which has taken a major public relations hit in the past few months of the war. Even the International Court of Justice, in its initial findings, has acknowledged that, and I quote from their findings, at least some of the acts and omissions alleged by South Africa to have been committed by Israel and Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. The ICJ has also ordered Israel to, and once again I quote, ensure with immediate effect that its military does not commit genocide. Now, this program has two episodes. The first deals with history, not the history of the Nakba per se, but the idea of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, and the right of return to this holy land by the Jewish people. Now, one of the Israeli historians, Shlomo Sand, wrote in The Making of the Jewish People, and I quote from what he has written, "For Israelis, specifically those of Jewish origin, their history rests on firm and precise truths." And this is what the Israelis think. They know for a certainty that a Jewish nation has been in existence since Moses received the tablets of the law on Mount Sinai, and that they are its direct and exclusive descendants, except for the 10 tribes who are yet to be located. They're convinced, as in the Israelis are convinced, that this nation came out of Egypt, conquered and settled the land of Israel, which had been famously promised it by the deity, created the magnificent kingdom of David and Solomon, which then split into the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. They are also convinced that this nation was exiled not once but twice after its periods of glory, after the fall of the first temple in the 6th century BCE, and again after the fall of the second temple in 70 CE. Yet, even before that second exile, this unique nation had created the Hebrew Hasmonean kingdom, which revolted against the wicked influence of Hellenization. Then, at the end of the 19th century, they contend rare circumstances combined to wake the ancient people from its long slumber and to prepare it for rejuvenation and for the return to its ancient homeland. This idea not just underpins the extremist ideology of illegal and violent Israeli settlers. Now, the court has finished as far as Sand is concerned. These violent Israeli settlers, but has also accepted implicitly and explicitly by Israel's Western backers. It's crucial to discuss these imaginary myths, not just because they have been instrumental in sustaining Israel's apartheid against the Palestinians, but also because Israel's existence is a geopolitical problem that threatens to destabilize the entire MENA region and beyond. The second episode will be a discussion on the current happenings in Gaza. For these two episodes, I have the pleasure of hosting Joseph Massad, a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia. Professor Massad is the author of several books, Desiring Arab, which came out in 2007, and was awarded the Lionel Trilling Book Award, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Essays on Zionism and the Palestinian Question, which is 2006, Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, 2001, and most recently, Islam and Liberalism, which has also been translated in Arabic. Professor Massad is also a regular contributor to Middle East Eye, a news website that covers the MENA region. Joseph, thank you so much for being on the program. I'm really pleased to have you, and virtually now. It was great to meet with you in person when you were in Lahore. So I want you to give our viewers a sense of, when they say a land without people for a people without land. Now, let's start with that. Who are these people? I mean, this is the Holy Land. Lots of these Israeli NGOs, B'Tselem and others, have actually made videos of these violent settlers who abuse them every time someone is making a video. They attack the Palestinians, and the common denominator that I have seen and heard in these videos is that this is the Holy Land. This is the land that God promised me. And therefore, I have a right to be in this land. And to the extent of my right being in this land, no one else has the right to be on this land. Let's begin there.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to appear on your program. I'm very happy to do so. And I'm, of course, having come to Lahore recently and had the pleasure of meeting you in person, this is all the more reason that we could have this sort of extended conversation. First of all, of course, even the slogan of a land without people for a people without land is in fact a Protestant, Christian, British slogan. And it tells us a lot about the movement that it came to be called Zionism. Zionism, of course, begins perhaps in its earliest manifestations in the Crusades of the 11th century. After all, it was the Crusades who began to also refer to Palestine as the Holy Land. And the idea at the time was that, in the major sort of papal announcement of the Crusades, the idea was that Palestine had to be cleansed of its both Muslim and non-Catholic occupiers. Remember, at the time, the majority of the inhabitants of Palestine were Arabic-speaking Eastern Christians, especially in Jerusalem, who, along with the Muslims, were ethnically cleansed to establish the first Crusader settler colonies, which culminated in the Latin Kingdom at that time, among others. So that was sort of the first instance of a Christian Zionism. However, this idea, although the Crusades, after they were defeated in the 13th century, would continue, the papacy would still have more crusades in the planning for another 2 centuries, but the larger idea of Zionism, in the sense that these European converts to Christianity had to be in possession of the land where their faith was born, would be revived with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. And as the Protestant Reformation sort of begins to articulate its position on this question, its main idea was that European Jews who had suffered under the Catholic Church, which the Protestant Reformation seemed to be critical of, the Protestants insisted that these Jews should in fact convert to a Protestant form of Christianity and then be presumably dispatched to Palestine to expedite the second coming of Jesus Christ as far as the Protestant ideology is concerned. So this is sort of the background to this. And the Protestants, especially what comes to be known as the millenarians amongst this evangelical, fanatical Protestant movement, begin to speak of something called restoration. The idea that European Jews are not converts to Judaism. Remember, Judaism had been a missionary religion since its inception and continued to be so, through another sort of the early part of the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. And in that sense, the idea that European Jews are somehow direct descendants of the ancient Hebrews is, of course, a bogus claim, that even if some Jews believed somehow some lineage, at least a religious or a spiritual lineage, by the 17th and 18th century, this idea amongst European Christians would become important, especially to estrange European Jews from Europe, and they begin to cast them as Asiatics, as people who had come from Asia originally. And as a result, increasingly, the idea that the Jews were a nation, with the rise of nationalist ideas in the late 18th and early 19th century, you begin to see even European philosophers like Immanuel Kant refer to European Jews as, quote, the Palestinians amongst us. So this attempt to alienate European Jews from Europe, the idea that they have a role to play in being converted to Protestant Christianity and expedite the second coming of Jesus Christ, became entrenched by the late 18th century and early 19th century. Especially in Britain, the British were, centrally located in this project and were especially fanatical in pursuing this project. There were a couple of movements of evangelical British Christians. You had the Church Missionary Society, or the CMS, which began to convert the heathens, as they called them, whether in the indigenous populations of West Africa or New Zealand, but also the Middle East, where they established schools and missions. And another very interesting group that emerges in Britain in around like 1808 that called themselves the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity amongst the Jews. And that particular society was very interested in converting British and German Jews. Britain at the time did not have many Jews. It had begun to allow Jews to come back to Britain after they were expelled in the 12th century. In the middle of the 18th century, this is what came to be known in Britain as the so-called Jewish Question, an expression or an idiom that would have a lot of currency in the 19th and the 20th century, but invented by the British to tackle for them the question of allowing Jews, especially German Jews, to come into Britain in the second half of the 18th century. So as this was happening, Britain had a small population of Jews at that time, and increasingly you have German Jewish immigration to Britain, amongst others. They zero in on some of the rabbis to convert them to Christianity. Indeed, one of them from Germany, from the Posen region, which was initially a Polish area occupied by Germany. So this particular sort of rabbi, whose father was a rabbi, comes to Britain, gets converted to evangelical Christianity, becomes a bishop, and then he becomes important for this evangelical movement, especially by the 1830s and 40s, because by then the British began to have a lot more influence over the Ottoman Empire, and they insist on building the first Protestant church anywhere in the Ottoman Empire, and they want to build it in Palestine, in Jerusalem. So this particular Jewish convert to Christianity, this Bishop Alexander, is dispatched to Palestine as the first bishop of the Anglican Church, with the idea that having a converted Jew to Christianity leading the church in Palestine would attract other Jewish European immigrants to convert to Protestantism and be convinced that they need to abandon their homes in Europe and come to Palestine to help this evangelical movement expedite the second coming of Jesus Christ. So this is how the movement begins as a Christian movement, specifically anti-Jewish, of course. We can't yet call it anti-Semitic because anti-Semitism rises in the second half of the 19th century as a movement. The term itself is invented in the 1860s. And anti-Semitism, of course, is distinguished from the hostility of European Christians to European Jews in that it zeroes in on the question of race. So the development of the scientific and biological races in the 19th century, suddenly European Jews are not only transformed into Asiatics, or a nation that is separate from European nations, as already had happened since the late 18th century. Suddenly they also begin to be a separate race. This begins sort of as a language project in the late 18th century to separate language families into what European philologists begin to call a Semitic language or an Indo-European Aryan language. But these two categories, Aryan and Semitic, are transformed into racial categories in the middle of the 19th century. And therefore, the rise of anti-Semitism, especially in Germany, but also in France, in the second half of the 19th century, grabs onto this idea of race, wherein now Jews become racialized, and therefore this becomes important that even Jews who convert to Christianity remain Jews racially, so they can still be targeted. So we see how this principle would subsequently be adopted by the Nazis, who not only killed Jews who had been, still Jewish religiously, or even abandoned Judaism but did not adopt Christianity, but also Jews who had been converted to Christianity or had parents who had converted. All of those would be targeted by the Nazis as racially Jewish. So we have a different kind of configuration of what happens to Jews. But the Jewish Zionist movement doesn't arise until the very late 19th century, in the 1890s. And they adopt this British evangelical idea that British Protestant evangelicals created, that Palestine was a land without people for a people without land. And of course, it began as a minority group, minority organization. The majority of Jews had opposed this, both Zionism in its Protestant manifestation and in its Jewish manifestation. So much so that when this newly created Zionist organization in 1897 and its founder, an Austrian journalist by the name of Theodor Herzl, decided to convene the first Congress of this movement in Munich. The rabbis in Munich, both those who belong to the Orthodox denomination as well as the Reformed denomination, got together and insisted on not giving any permission, indeed on making sure that such a Congress is not held in Munich, as a result, of course, of this rabbinical pressure. And again, these sets of rabbis, the Orthodox and the Reform, usually did not agree on much theologically, but they agreed that this movement called Zionism was in fact anti-Jewish, both religiously and socially. They forced Herzl and his group to move across the border to Switzerland, to Basel, where ultimately the first Zionist Congress was held in lieu of Munich, from which they were kicked out.
This is fascinating. Just to establish the point, much before Theodor Herzl, who's supposed to be the the founding father, or at least that's what the Israelis say, of Zionism, Zionism began with Christian millenarianism, which is part of the Christian eschatology.
Yes.
And the irony of that eschatology being anti-Semitic is completely lost on the Jewish population of the world. Is that right?
Well, it's not lost on the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement was very aware that its goals of emptying Europe of Jews were goals that were shared by anti-Semites. Theodor Herzl was very explicit on this in all his writings. He explained that, in fact, like the anti-Semites, he blamed the Jewish presence in Gentile societies as the cause for anti-Semitism. This is what the anti-Semites always alleged. And of course, Jews and anyone who was anti-racist would oppose that logic. But Theodor Herzl and the Zionists espoused the anti-Semitic logic that the presence of Jews in Gentile societies causes anti-Semitism, and therefore the way to end anti-Semitism is to remove Jews from Gentile societies. So this began to be the project, and of course the way out of that, or how to execute that, was through a settler-colonial movement. Now, Herzl himself would write in his pamphlet of 1896 that he called The State of the Jews, Der Judenstaat. And in his diaries, he spoke explicitly that anti-Semites are the natural allies of Zionism. And indeed, he felt that there were a lot of benefits to the anti-Semites. First of all, of course, they would get rid of the Jews, whom the anti-Semites claim take the jobs of poor European Christians. And also that the rich Jews who feel that poor Jews threaten their status in European society would be happy to fund this displacement of European Jews from Europe to Palestine. But his strategic interest in an alliance with anti-Semites was such that he would actually explicitly say verbatim that the anti-Semitic state will be our closest allies, and as would anti-Semites who would welcome our project. So it was not like a byproduct of the idea, but rather a strategy that both Herzl in his writings and subsequently the Zionist organization he founded would follow in allying the Zionist movement with anti-Semitic powers in Europe to bring about the Zionist project.
Okay, let me go back in time. This issue about the destruction of the temple, twice the destruction of the temple, and these exiles. I talked about Shlomo Zahn's work. He says that a lot of this is mythology, and the Babylonian exile did not displace everyone. It was just the Jewish elite that was displaced. So I want you to throw some light on this ancient history with reference to the exile, the destruction of the temple, because all of these issues in today's modern Zionism, which is obviously a settler colonial project, which has thrown up an apartheid state, and we're witnessing the consequences of that as far as the Palestinians are concerned. So I want some sort of explanation of how this works. And also that by many accounts, Judaism was an aggressively proselytizing religion at that time.
Well, I mean, of course, Shlomo Zahn's book really is a syncretic book that brings about already existing scholarship. I mean, a lot of the scholarship he relies on had already been published for decades before. He just brings it together in a very good way, I think, to sort of demonstrate the nationalist mythology of Zionism. Of course, in that sense, Zionism is not unique. All nationalisms create mythologies based on all kinds of ideological predispositions. What is, I guess, special here about Zionism is not only the invention of ancient Israel and the invention of Jews as descendants of the ancient Hebrews. It's almost like a Hitlerian project to speak of Jews genetically in this fashion. And it only becomes fashionable, of course, in the 19th century with the rise of racial science and the biological sciences. But this idea becomes important for a settler colonial project. Of course, there's been, the idea that the ancient Hebrews ended up leaving Palestine is historically, of course, proven not to be true at all. This is more of a religious mythology within Judaism. The majority of the Hebrews remained in Palestine. Indeed, they are the ones who converted to Christianity in Palestine when Christianity arose, and then many of those converted to Islam. So if one was to play this game of population origins, one could perhaps more readily say that it is the Palestinian people today who are the direct descendants of the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Canaanites and all the ancient peoples who lived in Palestine. This is especially important because the Israeli propaganda often claims that the Palestinians today are somehow descendants of Arab settlers who had come with the Arab Islamic conquest of Palestine. That, of course, is not true at all. The historical record is very clear on this. No more than 4,000 Arabs had settled in Palestine after the conquest. The majority of the population was Arabized and began to speak Arabic, but they're not descendants of Arab conquerors. On the contrary, there was the Arabo-Islamic conquest of Greater Syria, including Palestine, or even North Africa, was not a settler colonial project. Very few Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula moved to these regions beyond the small army, who often also would go back. So this is a very important point to make if one were to play this game of genealogy. But at the same time, of course, even were the Palestinians not indigenous to Palestine, which of course they are, this would not give some European Jewish converts the right to come and colonize Palestine. And after all, not only are European Jews designated by European racial and racist sciences since the 18th century as having originated outside of Europe, even Indo-Europeans and Aryans claim to have come from northern India, for example. If we are to rearrange the world based on where people originated from 2,000 years ago, then
it'll be utter chaos.
It's an utter joke. But even that is not true, you see. This is the thing. So the claim that European Jews are direct descendants of the ancient Hebrews is completely sort of a bogus claim. the claim that Palestinians are descendants of Arab colonists is a bogus claim. But even if both these claims were not bogus claims, and they were actually true, it would not translate into the right of European Jews to come in the late 19th or early 20th century and conquer the land of Palestine and expel its population. So in that sense, this is a problem. Now, of course, the mythologies also include aspects of the invention of ancient Israel. Israeli archaeologists also have, doubts about the existence of a second temple that was destroyed. But in any case, this is all a game of archaeology, and we know archaeology, of course, is part of colonialism. This is a science that begins in the late 18th century and early 19th century as part of the colonial venture. It comes through also from Egyptology, etc. So the irony is today, as a result of this European science and this European attempt to find origins for Europe and for other populations, is that Egyptian nationalists, for example, today would claim that they are direct descendants of the ancient pharaohs or the ancient Egyptians. Modern Iraqis, nationalists, would claim that they are direct descendants of the ancient Babylonians. The Jordanians would claim that they are descendants of the ancient Nabateans. The Lebanese could claim that they are descendants of the ancient Phoenicians. It is strange that the only people in that region, Palestinians, are unable to claim the ancient Hebrews as their ancestors because some strange European group is claiming them as their ancestors. So it's a very kind of if it were not so serious and impactful on the lives of the Palestinians and what had befallen them in the last 130 years, it would be laughable.
Absolutely, except that it's very tragic. I also want you to touch upon this dialectic between the religious symbolism or the religious history and the secular or supposedly secular project of Zionism that began with Herzl. And the reason I ask this is, this whole idea of the Messiah and the return to the Holy Land, strictly religiously speaking, this messianic thing was opposed by the rabbis, saying that unless the Messiah returns, there is no return to the Holy Land. Now, the only, off the top of my head, the only example that I can think of is Rabbi Alkalai's sort of innovative exegesis, saying that, before it goes to the house of David, it'll go to the house of Joseph. And so, in that sense, in that transition, you can go back to the Holy Land without the return of the Messiah. So that's one. And the second is more current in the sense of we now have extremist, illegal settlers occupying very important cabinet slots in Netanyahu's cabinet, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And their Zionism and their Eretz Israel project is deeply religious. So I want you to sort of unpack this for our viewers.
Well, first of all, of course, I mean, even though Zionism started out by claiming itself to be a secular project. I mean, Theodor Herzl was not a believer, and many of his colleagues were not either. They still, of course, relied on the Bible almost as a history book and as a geography book. So for secularists to actually use religious scriptures in this secular manner, as if they are actually accurate books of geography or history, is a very strange sort of amalgam of religio-secularism, if you will. So in that sense, they followed sort of in the footsteps of Christian evangelicals who also used the scriptures, especially the British fanatical evangelical Protestants who began to explore Palestine archaeologically. They set up the Palestine Exploration Fund. Remember, the 19th century also for these evangelicals came to be known for these European Christians as, quote, the peaceful crusade. So there was, they actually called it a crusade, but yet a peaceful one. Nonetheless, so in the case of the Zionist movement, it didn't attract a lot of religious folks. On the contrary, there was a lot of opposition by the Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism. A very small group of religious Jews from Poland joined the Zionists. The group was called, it's a spiritual center, Merkaz HaRuchani, known as Mizrahi, not to be confused with Mizrahi Jews today. Aside from that, another group that was anti-Zionist called Agudas Yisrael, now known as Agudat Yisrael, was a non-Zionist. However, it did not object to going to Palestine, not as a religious duty, necessarily, or as for the establishment of a Jewish state, but as part of a kind of, going there for religious reasons, but not for nationalist reasons. So the majority,
more likely like a pilgrimage, or just going there and settling there.
Sometimes also for scripture study or to live in the ancient sort of cities that had been important to Judaism, Jerusalem, Safad, Hebron, and Tiberias. Now, interestingly, of course, the Orthodox Judaism and Reform Judaism both opposed Zionism vehemently as an anti-Jewish sort of movement, and in contradiction with the Jewish scriptures and Jewish understanding of sort of the role of sort of Palestine or the arrival of the Messiah. Remember, for Jews, it is the first arrival of the Messiah. For the Protestants, it's the second coming of Jesus Christ. So they're related but different projects. You also see that this sort of religious opposition would continue until World War II. Even today, many Hasidic Jews are also opposed to Judaism. Perhaps the largest Hasidic denomination in the United States, the Satmars, about 100,000 strong, continues to oppose Zionism. However, we begin to see some cooperation between religious Jews and the Israeli state after the establishment of the state in 1948. This is why the state itself was not founded as necessarily secular. So in order for religious Jews to support the government had to make important religious sort of caveats, one of which is the respect of the Sabbath. So all government offices have to close on the Jewish Sabbath, that all government meals have to be offered in the form of kosher meals. They cannot violate the dietary laws of Judaism. So we see a number of these important caveats that had been indeed advanced by the Israeli state after 1948 as concessions to religious groups who were perhaps not Zionist, but not anti-Zionist. We can call them non-Zionist, if you will. There was a movement. Rabbi Kook was one of those who perhaps was most important, and then from the 30s onwards in elaborating a religious version of Zionism. His son in the 1960s, Rabbi Kook Jr., if you will, would lead an important movement which would sort of increase in size and in influence after the Israeli conquest in 1967 of the rest of Palestine, as well as the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt and the Golan Heights. It is then that you begin to have this very important religious movement. And the reason for that is, first of all, that the ancient Jewish sites that are considered holy by fanatical, fundamentalist religious Jews are actually located in the West Bank, not in the 1948 borders. So for many religious Jews, the idea of the 1948 borders is irrelevant to their religiosity and to these ancient sort of sites that they consider holy and that they insist that Jews should control. all of those sites, or the largest majority of them, are located in the West Bank, meaning in the territories conquered and occupied since 1967. So we begin to see now a major transformation within Zionism, which always relied on religious dicta, but still adhered to a certain secularist interpretation of them, now becoming much more fundamentalist in pursuing settler-colonialism in the West Bank and elsewhere. So as a result, for example, in Hebrew, the Jewish colonists of Palestine up to 1967 are called mityashvim, just settlers, whereas all the settlers and colonists who begin to colonize the West Bank territories are called mitnachlim. Mitnachlim comes from Nahalat Avot, or the legacy of the forefathers, and as such they are heirs to the forefathers, and this is the forefathers' land, and we are there to take it over. So it's even the terminology is much more religious, if you will.
Now, you mentioned Rabbi Cook Jr. And 1967 is a watershed in many ways, and there's still videos of the speech that he made crossing over into the West Bank and talking about settlements there. And as a matter of fact, it is said that Eshkol was kind of reluctant initially to somehow give it an official imprimatur, if you will, but then ultimately said, well, you can go ahead and do this. And so that seems to be the beginning of the illegal settlement project also, and also, as you mentioned, the kind of melding of the secular Zionism with the religious idea of the land of Israel.
Well, it's not. I mean, in Israel, it's not illegal. It's very legal to colonize the lands of the Palestinians, whether in 1948 or 1967. It is only illegal in international law because you're not allowed to change the demography of occupied territories. So within Israel, it's always been legal. Remember, it was the Labor government in Israel between 1967 and 1977 that had established upwards of 30 settler colonies in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and 15 were under construction when Likud took over. There's a bit of a liberal mythology amongst some liberal Zionists who want to claim that, in fact, when Israel occupied these territories, they occupied them because they are peace-loving. They had hoped to actually compromise with Palestinians and other Arab states to return these lands in exchange for peace that allegedly Israel had always sought. And they were not captured, that these lands were not captured for colonization. This is outright lies, and it's absolutely untrue because the colonization had begun under Labor. And when I speak about 30 colonies in the West Bank and Gaza, I'm not speaking about the colonization of East Jerusalem itself, let alone of the Golan Heights and the 20-some settlements that had been set up in the Sinai Peninsula itself, including the major colonial settlement city called Yamit on the Mediterranean, all of which, of course, had to be dismantled after the return of the Sinai to Egypt, although not to full Egyptian sovereignty, but to partial Egyptian sovereignty. So, so the idea that the Likud party subsequently was instrumental in the colonization project is not true. Likud actually simply continued a project that had already begun under the Laborites. And also, I mean, the idea that Begin or subsequent prime ministers were more religious because they had sort of weekly or monthly Bible study sessions is also untrue. Even Ben-Gurion, back in the 1950s, the secular first prime minister and long-standing prime minister of Israel, had also sort of Bible study sessions at the time, as would Netanyahu today, as did Begin. Yes, there was more accommodation to the new religious fundamentalists after 1967, but this would continue. I mean, perhaps some liberal Zionists find that the religious settler colonialists are somehow more egregious than their version of secular settler colonialism. As far as the Palestinian people are concerned, they're all colonists who have stolen the Palestinians' land and have subjected the Palestinian people to an apartheid racialist rule, which Israel calls democracy. And yes, it is a master race democracy. So it's a democracy for Jewish citizens, but not for non-Jews.
Absolutely. Two quick questions, Joseph, before we close this episode and go on to the next. One is, tell us about the Palestinian Christians. I mean, you belong to that community yourself. I mean, the background, and also the Jews that lived in Palestine, what they call the Sabra. What is their history, and what were the socioeconomic and political relations among these three monotheistic religions?
Well, of course, Palestinian Christians are Eastern Christians. They belong to the Arab Orthodox churches, which after the Ottoman conquest of Palestine, the Arab churches lost their autonomy because the Ottomans imposed the Greek Patriarchate on the Arab churches, so that now in English they are known as Greek Orthodox. But remember, of course, Greek Orthodox is a bad translation because in Arabic it would be called Roman Orthodox. And Roman, of course, refers to the Eastern Roman Empire whose capital was Constantinople. So all of the Arab East, the Arab Christians, were Orthodox in that sense, and they followed sort of the patriarch that existed for the Orthodox Church in Palestine in the 16th century. Patriarch Atallah was an Arabic-speaking native of Palestine. Subsequently, he would be replaced by Greek patriarchs imposed by the Ottomans, and who continue to control the Palestinian churches and their properties today. And the Greek Patriarchate today continues to sell the lands of the church to Israel or to Jewish buyers, with a huge opposition from the lay Palestinian community who oppose this patriarchate, which they see as colonial. Indeed, a huge struggle existed in the late 19th century by Syrian and Palestinian Arabs to overthrow these Greek patriarchs who took control of the church. The Syrians were able to do so in the late 19th century and replaced the Patriarch of Antioch with a Syrian Arab patriarch. The Palestinians failed and were unable to. And once the British occupied Palestine at the end of 1917, and subsequently when Jordan and Israel came to control different parts of Palestine, all of these forces continued to collaborate with the Greek Patriarchate and refused to support the lay community's attempt to overthrow them, with a struggle that continues today in the Palestinian lay communities and even the Jordanian lay Christian communities, whether inside Israel, in the West Bank, or in Jordan.
Palestinian Christian. Just one point of clarification. The Egyptian Coptic Church was separate from the Palestinian Arab Church?
The Egyptian Coptic Church is different because they have their own patriarch. So while they're Orthodox and are related in theology, they have their own patriarch and their own separate church that is also considered Orthodox. So there are very few theological, to my knowledge, disagreements between the two sects. However, so the Palestinian Christians, of course, are descendants of the ancient Palestinian Christians who continued to exist. Many of them over the years converted to Islam. It took about more than 4 centuries after the Arab Islamic conquest for Palestinian Christians to become a minority, which tells you that conversion was very gradual. Unlike Orientalist and Western attacks on Islam and Muslims as coercing people into conversion, that's not true at all. In the history of Syria and Egypt, the sort of conversion process took many centuries before Muslims became a majority. Now, so Palestinian Christians at the beginning of the British occupation were about 10 to 12% of the population. The Jews of Palestine were very small. Palestine had no a significant Jewish population at all over the centuries. By the beginning of the 19th century, there was about 4,000 Palestinian Jews, mostly descendants of Jews who had come to Palestine after the Spanish Reconquista of Andalusia, of Al-Andalus.
Many Jews.
Yes, Jews and Muslims were expelled. Many of them ended up in North Africa and the Ottoman lands, in what is today northern Greece and Salonika and Istanbul, as well as in Palestine. There was about, according to our sort of demographic censuses that are available, by the 1840s, you had basically about 340,000 Palestinian Muslims and Christians. Amongst them lived 4,000 Jews who were Arabic speakers who had come from Spain in the 16th century, and a new population of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who arrived in the early 19th century, also about 4,000 strong. They were known as the Perushim. As a result of the Protestant millenarian Reformation and Messianism, you begin to see after that the rise of some groups within European Jewry who became messianic. So we see even how Protestant theology affected Jewish theology and the rise of different messianic movements. The Perushim were followers of a Lithuanian rabbi who felt that Jews should come to Palestine for religious reasons in anticipation of what they thought would be the proximate arrival of the Messiah. So those were Yiddish speakers and were Ashkenazi Jews. So by the 1840s, basically, you have about 8,000 Jews and about 340,000 Muslims and Christians living in this area that was called Palestine, but did not really have clear borders, because Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, as was Syria, and there was all kinds of provincial divisions that the Ottoman, for administrative reasons. So some parts of Palestine included some parts of Lebanon, some parts of Syria included some parts of Palestine. So in general, what became mandatory Palestine, after the British conquest, had belonged to different administrative borders, which would change, over the years. So certain parts would include Lebanon, subsequently parts of Lebanon, sometimes other parts would not. So, but generally there was 3 administrative units within which were grouped the territories that came to be known as Palestine, but they were only administrative divisions, not, within the Ottoman Empire. The Jewish immigration would begin after the second half of the 19th century, especially after the Crimean War. You would begin to see the arrival of some Russian Jews in the 1870s. They remained small in number, but suddenly in the early 1880s, there developed a new sort of movement in southern Russia and the Russian Empire, in the colonial settler town of Odessa. Odessa, of course, was captured from the Ottomans in the late 18th century. It was called Haji Bey, an old Ottoman city. Catherine the Great would take it over, would call it Odessa, thinking that it was the location of the ancient Greek colony of Odessos, which turns out to be 50 kilometers away, and set up this new settler-colonial city of Odessa, to which she invited a variety of European populations to come in: Greeks, Italians, Bulgarians, Germans, and Polish and Russian Jews who lived in an area called the Pale of Settlement, which had been conquered by Russia from Poland in the 18th century. Odessa would become an important place for the development of early Zionist ideas of setting up agricultural colonies for Jews, not a state. So a group begins in the early 1880s called the Lovers of Zion, or Hovivei Tzion. They used to be known as Hebbat Tzion initially. who sought to set up agricultural colonies in Palestine. Not a novel idea. The idea of agricultural colonies, in fact, was something that Catherine the Great had begun. She was highly influenced by the Enlightenment in Europe. She thought of herself as a benevolent despot, and she communicated with several French thinkers, Voltaire and others. Catherine the Great, of course, was a German Protestant who married the Tsar and then converted to Orthodoxy, had him killed and became Tsarina herself. But what was interesting, of course, is there was new ideas in the late 18th century in France by a new group of what we might call today proto-economists that called themselves the physiocrats. The physiocrats theorized that the only productive labor was agricultural labor, and that you had to live on land to be able to be productive. And they looked askance at trade. And as a result, many Jewish intellectuals came to see the physiocrats as anti-Semitic, seeing that because Jews could not own land in much of Eastern Europe, and their trades claimed to be considered unproductive, especially because many of them were craftsmen and artisans. Nonetheless, so this idea of agriculture will set you free, if you will, by the physiocrats would be adopted by Catherine the Great, who decided that perhaps it is a good thing to do to end the massive Jewish poverty in the Pale of Settlement, which she came to control after the division of Poland between Prussia, Austro-Hungary, and Russia. So she began a movement in the late 18th century, which other czars would continue, of Jewish colonization of New Russia. The New Russia was the southern area of Russia that was conquered from the Ottomans, which today includes much of what is called southern Ukraine and other areas, where Odessa was. So they set up a lot of Jewish agricultural colonies throughout the 19th century. So by the time the early 1880s, when you get this new Jewish group in Odessa wanting to set up agricultural colonies. And the idea for them, however, was not to set them up in Russia, as they had been, and there had been many still surviving agricultural colonies then, but to do it in Palestine. So they sought financial support from West European Jewish wealthy bankers who sort of took up this project, mostly because, of course, in the 1880s, poverty in Russia had increased measurably, especially after the end of feudalism. Poverty of the Jewish population had increased. And after the assassination of Tsar Alexander, there was an anti-Jewish campaign by the Russian state and egging on some of the Russian population to also attack Jews. So you began to see a huge immigration movement from Russia to Western Europe and to America. This was of major concern to West European Jews who had become integrated since the French Revolution in France, in Britain, in Germany, and they saw these religious and poor East European Jews as threatening their status as equal citizens of these states, which prompted them to support financially the movement of these poor Jews from Eastern Europe to the Americas and possibly to Palestine to set up settler colonies, to avoid having them coming to Europe, where there was a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment increasing, including the anti-Semitic movement that we spoke about earlier in this episode with the rise of anti-Semitism.
Absolutely. Fascinating overview of history. Joseph, thank you so much for that. And I'm going to say publicly what I have told you privately, that one of the things that I love about your work, whether you're writing an op-ed or a book, is to actually put a perspective on events in and through historical development. I think that's something which is absolutely a must. And I'm so grateful that, as Benedict Anderson talked about, these imagined communities, and Israel and this modern Zionism is also an imagination. And we've also somehow looked at the dialectic between how it kind of refers to the Bible, and how that reference to the Bible has actually now allowed religious Zionism to be dominant in so many ways.
But also, I think it bears mentioning that the major influence, really ideological influence, was settler colonialism more generally. That basically the Zionist movement partook of a European effort to colonize, especially Africa, but including North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. So, but also that they borrowed a lot of ideas, not only the land without people for a people without land, but even the idea that European Jews were, quote unquote, returning to Palestine. This is a colonial idea that the French used, for example, when they conquered Algeria, claiming that they were returning to the lands of the ancient Roman Empire. When the Italians conquered Libya, they claimed the same thing. Mussolini would speak about, him becoming the new emperor of the Roman Empire, and that the Arabs of North Africa were the colonists. So this idea of the return is not really a Zionist Jewish idea, but a European colonial idea that Zionists
embedded. Absolutely. I'm happy you talked about Algeria. In fact, we're going to put a link to your latest op-ed also, which has references to Algerian independence. And the fact that since you talked about the French, as eminent as Alexis de Tocqueville was, he was quite a votary for French colonialism in Algeria. But we will, in the second episode of this program, get to the current events and how the situation is unfolding. So this is all from this episode. If you like the discussion, click on the subscribe button. That helps us bring you quality discussions. Until our next episode, goodbye and stay safe.